Welcome to Noctis, Inkborne, a place where timeless literature finds a calm and thoughtful voice. Here we bring classic works to life with steady, soothing narration, meant to help you listen, learn, and reflect without distraction. Today we begin Part 1 of Discourses on Livy, written by Niccolò Machiavelli. This is the first half of the complete audiobook, exploring Machiavelli's insights into history, politics, and the foundations of a strong republic. Settle in, relax, and enjoy this clear and peaceful narration of Discourses on Livy, Part 1. Chapter 1. Of the beginnings of cities in general, and in particular of that of Rome. No one who reads how the city of Rome had its beginning, who were its founders, and what its ordinances and laws, will marvel that so much excellence was maintained in it through many ages, or that it grew afterwards to be so great an empire. And first, as touching its origin, I say that all cities have been founded either by the people of the country in which they stand, or by strangers. Cities have their origins in the former of these two ways, when the inhabitants of a country find that they cannot live securely if they live dispersed in many and small societies, each of them unable to stand alone against the attacks of its enemies, on whose approach there is no time left to unite for defense without abandoning many strongholds, and thus becoming an easy prey to the invader. To escape these dangers, whether of their own motion or at the instance of some of greater authority among them, they restrict themselves to dwell together in certain places which they think will be more convenient to live in and easier to defend. Among many cities taking their origin in this way were Athens and Venice, the former of which, for reasons like those just now mentioned, was built by a scattered population under the direction of Theseus. To escape the wars which, on the decay of the Roman Empire, daily renewed in Italy by the arrival of fresh hordes of barbarians, numerous refugees, sheltering in certain little islands in a corner of the Adriatic Sea, gave beginning to Venice, where, without any recognized leader to direct them, they agreed to live together under such laws as they thought best suited to maintain them. And by reason of the prolonged tranquility which their position secured, they being protected by the narrow sea and by the circumstance that the tribes who then harassed Italy had no ships wherewith to molest them, they were able from very small beginnings to attain to that greatness they now enjoy. In the second case, namely of a city being founded by strangers, the settlers are either wholly independent or they are controlled by others, as where colonies are sent forth either by a prince or by a republic to relieve their countries of an excessive population, or to defend newly acquired territories which it is sought to secure at small cost. Of this sort, many cities were settled by the Romans and in all parts of their dominions. It may also happen that such cities are founded by a prince merely to add to his renown, without any intention on his part to dwell there, as Alexandria was built by Alexander the Great. Cities like these, not having had their beginning in freedom, seldom make such progress as to rank among the chief towns of kingdoms. The city of Florence belongs to that class of towns which has not been independent from the first. For whether we ascribe its origin to the soldiers of Sylla, or, as some have conjectured, to the mountaineers of Fiesole, who, emboldened by the long peace which prevailed throughout the world during the reign of Octavianus, came down to occupy the plain on the banks of the Arno, in either case it was founded under the auspices of Rome, and could not at first make other progress than was permitted by the grace of the sovereign state. The origin of cities may be said to be independent when a people, either by themselves or under some prince, are constrained by famine, pestilence, or war to leave their native land and seek a new habitation. Settlers of this sort either establish themselves in cities which they find ready to their hand in the countries of which they take possession, as did Moses, or they build new ones, as did Aeneas. It is in this last case that the merits of a founder and the good fortune of the city founded are best seen, and this good fortune will be more or less remarkable according to the greater or less capacity of him who gives the city its beginning. The capacity of a founder is known in two ways, by his choice of a site or by the laws which he frames. And since men act either of necessity or from choice, and merit may seem greater where choice is more restricted, we have to consider whether it may not be well to choose a sterile district as the site of a new city, in order that the inhabitants, being constrained to industry and less corrupted by ease, may live in closer union, finding less cause for division in the poverty of their land, as was the case in Ragusa and in many other cities built in similar situations. Such a choice were certainly the wisest and the most advantageous, could men be content to enjoy what is their own without seeking to lord it over others. But since to be safe they must be strong, they are compelled to avoid these barren districts and to plant themselves in more fertile regions, where, the fertility of the soil enabling them to increase and multiply, they may defend themselves against any who attack them and overthrow any who would withstand their power. And as for that languor which the situation might breed, care must be had that hardships which the site does not enforce shall be enforced by the laws, and that the example of those wise nations be imitated, who, inhabiting most fruitful and delightful countries, and such were likely to rear a listless and effeminate race, unfit for all manly exercises, in order to obviate the mischief wrought by the amenity and relaxing influence of the soil and climate, subjected all who were to serve as soldiers to the severest training, whence it came that better soldiers were raised in these countries than in others by nature rugged and barren. Such was of old the kingdom of the Egyptians, which, though of all lands the most bountiful, yet by the severe training which its laws enforced, produced most valiant soldiers, who, had their names not been lost in antiquity, might be thought to deserve more praise than Alexander the Great and many besides, whose memory is still fresh in men's minds. And even in recent times, anyone contemplating the kingdom of the Soldan and the military order of the Mamluks before they were destroyed by Selim the Grand Turk, must have seen how carefully they trained their soldiers in every kind of warlike exercise, showing thereby how much they dreaded that indolence to which their genial soil and climate might have disposed them unless neutralized by strenuous laws. I say then that it is a prudent choice to found your city in a fertile region when the effects of that fertility are duly balanced by the restraint of the laws. When Alexander the Great thought to add to his renown by founding a city, Dinocrates the architect came and showed him how he might build it on Mount Athos, which not only offered a strong position, but could be handled, that the city built there might present a semblance of the human form, which would be a thing strange and striking and worthy of so great a monarch. But on asking how the inhabitants were to live, Dinocrates answered that he had not thought of that, whereupon Alexander laughed, and leaving Mount Athos as it stood, built Alexandria, where the fertility of the soil and the vicinity of the Nile and the sea might attract many to take up their abode. To him, therefore, who inquires into the origin of Rome, if he assign its beginning to Aeneas, it will seem to be of those cities which were founded by strangers; if to Romulus, then of those founded by the natives of the country. But in whichever class we place it, it will be seen to have had its beginning in freedom, and not in subjection to another state. It will be seen, too, as hereafter shall be noted, how strict was the discipline which the laws instituted by Romulus, Numa, and its other founders made compulsory upon it, so that neither its fertility, the proximity of the sea, the number of its victories, or the extent of its dominion could corrupt it for many centuries, but on the contrary, maintained it replete with such virtues as were never matched in any other commonwealth. And because the things done by Rome, and which Titus Livius has celebrated, were effected at home or abroad, by public or by private wisdom, I shall begin by treating and noting the consequences of those things done at home in accordance with the public voice, which seem to most merit attention. And to this object the whole of this first book, or first part of my Discourses, shall be directed. Chapter 2. Of the various kinds of government, and to which one of them the Roman Commonwealth belonged. I forego all discussion concerning those cities which, at the outset, have been dependent upon others, and shall speak only of those which, from their earliest beginnings, have stood entirely clear of all foreign control, being governed from the first as pleased themselves, whether as republics or as princedoms. These, as they have had different origins, so likewise have had different laws and institutions. For to some, at their very first commencement, or not long after, laws have been given by a single legislator, and all at one time, like those given by Lycurgus to the Spartans, while to others they have been given at different times, as need rose or accident determined, as in the case of Rome. That republic, indeed, may be called happy, whose lot has been to have a founder so prudent as to provide for it laws under which it can continue to live securely, without need to amend them, as we find Sparta preserving hers for 800 years without deterioration and without any dangerous disturbance. On the other hand, some measure of unhappiness attaches to the state which, not having yielded itself once for all into the hands of a single wise legislator, is obliged to recast its institutions for itself. And of such states, by far the most unhappy is that which is furthest removed from a sound system of government, by which I mean that its institutions lie wholly outside the path that might lead it to a true and perfect end. For it is scarcely possible that a state in this position can ever by any chance set itself to rights, whereas another, whose institutions are imperfect, if it have made a good beginning, and such as admits of its amendment, may in the course of events arrive at perfection. It is certain, however, that such states can never be reformed without great risk. For, as a rule, men will not accept new law altering the institutions of their state, unless the necessity for such a change be demonstrated. And since this necessity cannot arise without danger, the state may easily be overthrown before the new order of things is established. In proof of which, we may instance the Republic of Florence, which was reformed in the year 1502 in consequence of the affair of Arezzo, but was ruined in 1512 in consequence of the affair of Prato. Desiring, therefore, to discuss the nature of the government of Rome, and to ascertain the accidental circumstances which brought it to its perfection, I say, as has been said before by many who have written of governments, that of these there are three forms, known by the names monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy, and those who give its institutions to a state have recourse to one or other of these three, according as it suits their purpose. Other, and as has been thought by many, wiser teachers, will have it that there are altogether 6 forms of government, 3 of them utterly bad, the other 3 good in themselves, but so readily corrupted that they too are apt to become hurtful. The good are the 3 above named, the bad 3 others dependent upon these, and each so like to that which it is related that it is easy to pass insensibly from the one to the other. For a monarchy readily becomes a tyranny, an aristocracy an oligarchy, and a democracy tends to degenerate into anarchy. So that if the founder of a state should establish any one of these 3 forms of government, he establishes it for a short time only, since no precaution he may take can prevent it from sliding into its contrary, by reason of the close resemblance which in this case the virtue bears to the vice. These diversities in the form of government spring up among men by chance. For in the beginning of the world, its inhabitants, being few in number, for a time lived scattered after the fashion of beasts. But afterwards, as they increased and multiplied, gathered themselves into societies, and, the better to protect themselves, began to seek who among them was the strongest and of the highest courage, to whom, making him their head, they tendered obedience. Next arose the knowledge of such things as are honorable and good, as opposed to those which are bad and shameful. For observing that when a man wronged his benefactor, hatred was universally felt for the one, and sympathy for the other, and that the ungrateful were blamed, while those who showed gratitude were honored, and reflecting that the wrongs they saw done to others might be done to themselves, to escape these, they resorted to making laws and fixing punishments against any who should transgress. And in this way grew the recognition of justice. Whence it came that afterwards, in choosing their rulers, men no longer looked about for the strongest, but for that who was the most prudent and the most just. But presently, when sovereignty grew to be hereditary and no longer elective, hereditary sovereigns began to degenerate from their ancestors, and, quitting worthy courses, took up the notion that princes had nothing to do but to surpass the rest of the world in sumptuous display and wantonness, and whatever else ministers to pleasure, so that the prince coming to be hated, and therefore to feel fear, and passing from fear to infliction of injuries, a tyranny soon sprang up. Forthwith there began movements to overthrow the prince, and plots and conspiracies against him, undertaken not by those who were weak or afraid for themselves, but by such as being conspicuous for their birth, courage, wealth, and station, could not tolerate the shameful life of the tyrant. The multitude, following the lead of these powerful men, took up arms against the prince, and, he being got rid of, obeyed these others as their liberators, who, on their part, holding in hatred the name of sole ruler, formed themselves into a government, and, at first, while the recollection of past tyranny was still fresh, observed the laws they themselves made, and postponing personal advantage to the common welfare, administered affairs both publicly and privately with the utmost diligence and zeal. But this government passing afterwards to their descendants, who, never having been taught in the school of adversity, knew nothing of the vicissitudes of fortune, these not choosing to rest content with mere civil equality, but abandoning themselves to avarice, ambition, and lust, converted, without respect to civil rights, what had been a government of the best into a government of the few, and so very soon met the same fate as the tyrant. For the multitude, loathing its rulers, lent itself to any who ventured, in whatever way, to attack them, when some one man speedily arose, who with the aid of the people overthrew them. But the recollection of the tyrant and of the wrongs suffered at his hands, being still fresh in the minds of the people, who therefore felt no desire to restore the monarchy, they had recourse to a popular government, which they established on such a footing that neither king nor nobles had any place in it. And because all governments inspire respect at the first, this government also lasted for a while, but not for long, and seldom after the generation that brought it into existence had died out. For suddenly liberty passed into license, wherein neither private worth nor public authority was respected, but everyone living as he liked, 1,000 wrongs were done daily. Whereupon, whether driven by necessity, or on the suggestion of some wiser man among them, and to escape anarchy, the people reverted to a monarchy, from which, step by step, in the manner and for the causes already assigned, they came round once more to license. For this is the circle revolving within which all states are and have been governed, although in the same state the same forms of government rarely repeat themselves, because hardly any state can have such vitality as to pass through such a cycle more than once, and still together. For it may be expected that in some sea of disaster, when a state must always be wanting prudent counsels and in strength, it will become subject to some neighboring and better governed state. But assuming this not to happen, it might well pass for an indefinite period from one of these forms of government to another.
I say then that all these 6 forms of government are pernicious, the 3 good kinds from their brief duration, the 3 bad from their inherent badness. Wise legislators, therefore, knowing these defects and avoiding each of these forms in its simplicity, have made a choice of a form that shares in the qualities of all the first 3, and which they judge to be more stable than any of these separately. For where we have a monarchy and an aristocracy and a democracy existing together in the same city, each of the 3 serves as a check upon the other. Among those who have earned special praise by devising a constitution of this nature was Lycurgus, who so framed the laws of Sparta as to assign their proper functions to kings, nobles, and commons, and in this way established a government which, to his great glory and to the peace and tranquillity of his country, lasted for more than 800 years. The contrary, however, happened in the case of Solon, who, by the turn he gave to the institutions of Athens, created there a purely democratic government, of such brief duration that I himself lived to witness the beginning of the despotism of Pisistratus. And although 40 years later the heirs of Pisistratus were driven out, and Athens recovered her freedom, nevertheless, because she reverted to the same form government as had been established by Solon, she could maintain it for only 100 years more. For, though to preserve it, many ordinances were passed for repressing the ambition of the great and the turbulence of the people, against which Solon had not provided, still, since neither the monarchic nor the aristocratic element was given a place in her constitution, Athens, as compared to Sparta, but had a short life. But let us now turn to Rome, which city, although she had no Lycurgus to give her from the first such a constitution as would preserve her long in freedom, through a series of accidents caused by the contests between the commons and the Senate, obtained by chance what the foresight of her founders failed to provide. So that fortune, if she bestowed not her first favors on Rome, bestowed her second, because although the original institutions of this city were defective, still they lay not outside the true path which could bring them to perfection. For Romulus and the other kings made many and good laws, and such which were not incompatible with freedom, but because they sought to found a kingdom and not a commonwealth, when the city became free, many things were found wanting, which in the interest of liberty it was necessary to supply, since these kings had not supplied them. And although the kings of Rome lost their sovereignty in the manner and for the causes mentioned above, nevertheless, those who drove them out, by at once creating 2 consuls to take their place, preserved in Rome the regal authority while banishing from it the regal throne, so that both Senate and consuls were included in that republic. It in fact possessed 2 of the elements above enumerated, to wit, the monarchic and the aristocratic. It then only remained to assign its place to the popular element, and the Roman nobles, growing insolent for causes which shall be noticed hereafter, rose against them, when, not to lose the whole of their power, they were forced to concede a share to the people, while with the share that remained, the Senate and consuls retained so much authority that they still held their place in the republic. In this way, the tribunes of the people came to be created, after whose creation the stability of the state was much augmented, since each of the 3 forms of government had now its due influence allowed it. And such was the good fortune of Rome, that although her government passed from the kings to the nobles, and from these to the people, by the steps and for the reasons noticed above, still the entire authority of the kingly element was not sacrificed to strengthen the authority of the nobles, nor were the nobles divested of their authority to bestow it on the commons, but 3 blending together made up a perfect state, which perfection, as shall be fully shown in the next 2 chapters, was reached through the dissensions of the Commons and the Senate.
Chapter 3. Of the accidents which led in Rome to the creation of tribunes of the people, whereby the republic was made more perfect. They who lay the foundations of a state and furnish it with laws must, as is shown by all who have treated of civil government, and by examples of which history is full, assume that all men are bad, and will always, when they have free field, give loose to their evil inclinations, and that if these for a while remain hidden, it is owing to some secret cause, which, from having no contrary experience, we do not recognize at once, but which is afterwards revealed by time, of whom we speak as the Father of all truth. In Rome, after the extension of the Tarquins, it seemed as though the closest union prevailed between the Senate and the Commons, and that the nobles, laying aside their natural arrogance, had learned so to sympathize with the people as to have become supportable by all, even of the humblest rank. This dissimulation remained undetected and its causes concealed while the Tarquins lived. For the nobles, dreading the Tarquins and fearing that the people, if they used them ill, might take part against them, treated them with kindness. But no sooner were the Tarquins got rid of, and the nobles thus relieved of their fears, when they began to spit forth against the Commons all the venom which before they had kept in their breasts, offending and insulting them in every way they could, confirming what I have observed already, that men never behave well unless compelled, and that whenever they are free to act as they please, and are under no restraint, everything falls at once into confusion and disorder. Wherefore, it has been said that as poverty and hunger are needed to make men industrious, so laws are needed to make them good. When we do well without laws, laws are not needed, but when good customs are absent, laws are at once required. On the extinction of the Tarquins, therefore, the dread of whom had kept the nobles in check, some new safeguard had to be contrived, which should effect the same result as had been effected by the Tarquins while they lived. Accordingly, after much uproar and confusion, and much danger of violence ensuing between the Commons and the nobles, to ensure the safety of the former, tribunes were created, and were invested with such station and authority as always afterwards enabled them to stand between the people and the Senate, and to resist the insolence of the nobles. Chapter 4. That the dissensions between the Senate and Commons of Rome made Rome free and powerful. Touching those tumults which prevailed in Rome from the extinction of the Tarquins to the creation of the tribunes, the discussion of which I have no wish to avoid, and as to certain other matters of a like nature, I desire to say something in opposition to the opinion of many who assert that Rome was a turbulent city and had fallen into utter disorder, that had not her good fortune and her military prowess made amends for other defects, she would have been inferior to every other republic. I cannot deny, indeed, that the good fortune and the armies of Rome were the causes of her empire, but it certainly seems to me that those holding this opinion fail to perceive that in a state where there are good soldiers, there must be good order, and generally speaking, good fortune. And looking to the other circumstances of this city, I affirm that those who condemn these dissensions between the nobles and the commons condemn what was the prime cause of Rome becoming free, and give more heed to the tumult and uproar with which these dissensions were attended than the good results which followed from them, not reflecting that while in every republic there are two conflicting factions, that of the people and that of the nobles, it is in this conflict that all laws favorable to freedom have their origin, as may readily be seen to have been the case in Rome. For from the time of the Tarquins to that of the Gracchi, a period of over 300 years, the tumults in Rome seldom gave occasion to punishment by exile, and very rarely to bloodshed, so that we cannot truly declare those tumults to have been disastrous, or that republic to have been disorderly, which during that all time, on account of its internal broils, banished no more than 8 or 10 of its citizens, put very few to death, and rarely inflicted monetary penalties. Nor can we reasonably pronounce that city ill-governed in which we find so many instances of virtue. For virtuous actions have their origin in right training.
right training in wise laws, and wise laws in these very tumults which many would thoughtlessly condemn. For he who looks well to the results of these tumults will find that they did not lead to banishments, nor to violence hurtful to the common good, but to laws and ordinances beneficial to the public liberty. And should any object that the behavior of the Romans was extravagant and outrageous, that for the assembled people to be heard shouting against the Senate against the people, for the whole commons to be seen rushing wildly through the streets, closing their shops and quitting the town, were things which might well affright him, even who only reads of them, it may be answered that the inhabitants of all cities, more especially of cities which seek to make use of the people in matters of importance, have their own ways of giving expression to their wishes, among which the city of Rome had the custom that when its people sought to have a law passed, they followed one or another of those courses mentioned above, or else refused to be enrolled as soldiers when, to pacify them, something of their demands had to be conceded. But the demands of a free people are rarely hurtful to freedom, since they originate either in being oppressed or in the fear that they are about to be so. When this fear is groundless, it finds its remedy in public meetings, wherein some worthy person may come forward and show the people by argument that they are deceiving themselves. For though they be ignorant, the people are not therefore, as Cicero says, incapable of being taught the truth, but are readily convinced when it is told to them by one in whose honesty they can trust. Therefore, we should be careful how we censure the government of Rome, and should reflect that all the great results effected by that republic could not have come about without good cause, and if the popular tumults led the creation of the tribunes, they merit all praise, since these magistrates not only gave its due influence to the popular voice in the government, but also acted as the guardians of Roman freedom, as shall be clearly shown in the following chapter.
Chapter 5. Whether the guardianship of public freedom is safer in the hands of the commons or of the nobles, and whether those who seek to acquire power or they who seek to maintain it are the greater cause of commotions. Of the provisions made by wise founders of republics, one of the most necessary is for the creation of a guardianship of liberty. For as according as this is placed in good or bad hands, the freedom of the state will be more or less lasting. And because in every republic we find the two parties of nobles and commons, the question arises to which of these two this guardianship can most safely be entrusted. Among the Lacedaemonians of old, as now with the Venetians, it was placed in the hands of the nobles, but with the Romans it was vested in the commons. We have therefore to determine which of these states made the wiser choice. If we look to reasons, something is to be said on both sides of the question. Though were we to look to results, we should have to pronounce in favor of the nobles, inasmuch as the liberty of Sparta and Venice has had a longer life than that of Rome. As touching reasons, it may be pleaded for the Roman method, that they are most fit to have charge of a thing who least desire to pervert it to their own ends. And doubtless, if we examine the aims which the nobles and the commons respectively set before them, we shall find in the former a great desire to dominate, in the latter merely a desire not to be dominated over, and hence a greater attachment to liberty, since they have less to gain than the others by destroying it. Wherefore, when the commons are put forward as the defenders of liberty, they may be expected to take better care of it, and as they have no desire to tamper with it themselves, to be less apt to suffer others to do so. On the other hand, he who defends the method followed by the Spartans and Venetians may urge that by confiding this guardianship to the nobles, two desirable ends are served. First, that from being allowed to retain in their own hands a weapon which makes them the stronger party in the state, the ambition of this class is more fully satisfied, and second, that an authority is withdrawn from the unstable multitude, which, as used by them, is likely to lead to endless disputes and tumults, and to drive the nobles into dangerous and desperate courses. Instance of which might be cited the case of Rome itself, wherein the tribunes of the people, being vested with this authority, not content to have one consul a plebeian, insisted on having both,
and afterwards laid claim to the censorship, the praetorship, and all the other magistracies in the city. Nor was this enough for them, but, carried away by the same factious spirit, they began after a time to pay court to such men as they thought able to attack the nobility, and so gave occasion to the rise of Marius and the overthrow of Rome. Wherefore, one who weighs both sides of the question well might hesitate which party he should choose as the guardian of public liberty, being uncertain which class is more mischievous in a commonwealth, that which would acquire what it has not, or that which would keep the authority which it has already. But on the whole, on a careful balance of arguments, we may sum up thus. Either we have to deal with a republic eager, like Rome, to extend its power, or with one content merely to maintain itself. In the former case, it is necessary to do in all things as Rome did. In the latter, for the reasons and in the manner to be shown in the following chapter, we may imitate Venice and Sparta. But reverting to the point first raised, I believe it is necessary for us to follow the method of the Romans, and not that of the other republics. For I know of no middle way. We must therefore put up with those dissensions which arise between Commons and Senate, looking on them as evils which cannot be escaped, if we would arrive at the greatness of Rome. In connection with the arguments here used to prove that the authority of the tribunes was essential in Rome to the guardianship of freedom, we may naturally go on to show what advantages result to a republic from the power of impeachment, which, together with others, was conferred on the tribunes, a subject to be noticed in the following chapter.
Chapter 7. That to preserve liberty in a state, there must exist the right to accuse. To those set forward in a commonwealth as guardians of public freedom, no more useful or necessary authority can be given than the power to accuse, either before the people or before some council or tribunal, those citizens who in any way have offended against the liberty of their country. A law of this kind has two effects most beneficial to a state. First, that the citizens, from fear of being accused, do not engage in attempts hurtful to the state, or doing so, are put down at once and without respect of persons. And next, that a vent is given for the escape of all those evil humors which, from whatever cause, gather in cities against particular citizens. For unless an outlet be duly provided for these by the laws, they flow into irregular channels and overwhelm the state. There is nothing, therefore, which contributes so much to the stability and permanence of a state as to take care that the fermentation of these disturbing humors be supplied by operation of law with a recognized outlet. This might be shown by many examples, but by none so clearly as that of Coriolanus, related by Livius, where he tells us that at a time when the Roman nobles were angry with the plebeians, thinking that the appointment of tribunes for their protection had made them too powerful, it happened that Rome was visited by a grievous famine, to meet which the Senate sent to Sicily for corn. But Coriolanus, hating the commons, sought to convince the Senate that now was the time to punish them, and to deprive them of the authority which they had usurped to the prejudice of the nobles, by withholding the distribution of corn, and so suffering them to perish of hunger. Which advice of his, coming to the ears of the people, kindled them to such fury against him, that they would have slain him as he left the Senate house, had the tribunes not cited him to appear and answer before them to a formal charge. In respect of this incident, I repeat what I have just now said, how useful and necessary it is for republics to provide by their laws a channel by which the displeasure of the multitude against a single citizen may find a vent. For when none such is regularly provided, recourse will be had to irregular channels, and these will assuredly lead to much worse results. For when a citizen is borne down by the operation of the ordinary laws, even though he be wronged, little or no disturbance is occasioned to the state, the injury he suffers not being wrought by private violence or by foreign force, which are the causes of the overthrow of free institutions, but by public authority
and in accordance with public ordinances, which having definite limits set them, are not likely to pass beyond these, so as to endanger the commonwealth. For proof of which, I am content to rest on this old example of Coriolanus, since all may see what a disaster it would have been for Rome had he been violently put to death by the people. For as between citizen and citizen a wrong would have been done, affording ground for fear. Fear would have sought defense, defense have led to faction, faction to divisions in the state, and these to its ruin. But the matter being taken up by those whose office it was to deal with it, all the evils which must have followed, had it been left in private hands, were escaped. In Florence, on the other hand, and in our own days, we have seen what violent commotions follow when the people cannot show their displeasure against particular citizens in a form recognized by the laws. In the instance of Francesco Valori, at one time looked upon as the foremost citizen of our republic, but many thinking him ambitious, and likely, from his high spirit and daring, to overstep the limits of civil freedom, and there being no way to oppose him save by setting up an adverse faction, the result was that, apprehending irregular attacks, he sought to gain partisans for his support, while his opponents, on their side, having no course open to them of which the laws approved, resorted to courses of which the laws did not approve, and at last to open violence. And as his influence had to be attacked by unlawful methods, these were attended by injury, not only to him, but to many other noble citizens, whereas could he have been met by constitutional restraints, his power might have been broken without injury to any save himself. I might also cite from our Florentine history the fall of Piero Soderini, which had no other cause than there not being in our republic any law under which powerful and ambitious citizens can be impeached. For to form a tribunal by which a powerful citizen is to be tried, 8 judges are not enough. The judges must be numerous, because a few will always do the will of a few. But had there been proper methods for obtaining redress, either the people would have impeached Piero if he was guilty, and thus have given vent to their displeasure without calling in the Spanish army, or, if he was innocent, would not have ventured, through fear of being accused themselves, to have taken proceedings against him. So that in either case, the bitter spirit, which was the cause of all the disorder, would have had an end. Wherefore, when we find one of the parties in a state calling in a foreign power, we can safely conclude that it is because the defective laws of that state provide no escape for those malignant humors which are natural to men, which can best be done by arranging for an impeachment before a sufficient number of judges, and by giving countenance to this procedure. This was so well contrived in Rome that in spite of the perpetual struggle maintained between the Commons and the Senate, neither the Senate nor the Commons, nor any single citizen, ever sought redress at the hands of a foreign power. For having a remedy at home, there was no need to seek one abroad. Although the examples above be proof sufficient of what I affirm, I desire to adduce one other recorded by Titus Livius in his history, where he relates that a sister of Auron's, having been rapist by a Lucamo of Clusium, the chief of the Etruscan towns, Auron's being unable, from the interest of her rapist, to avenge her, betook himself to the Gauls, who ruled in the province we now name Lombardy, and besought them to come with an armed force to Clusium, showing them how with advantage to themselves they could avenge his wrongs. Now had Auron seen that he could have had redress through the laws of his country, he never would have resorted to these barbarians for help. But as the right to accuse is beneficial in a republic, so calumny, on the other hand, is useless and hurtful, as in the following chapter I shall proceed to show. Chapter 8. That calumny is as hurtful in a commonwealth as the power to accuse is useful. Such were the services rendered to Rome by Furius Camillus in rescuing her from the oppression of the Gauls, that no Roman, no matter how high his degree or station, held it derogatory to yield place to him, save only Manius Capitolinus, who could not brook such glory and distinction being given to another. for he thought that in saving the capital he himself had done as much as Camillus to preserve Rome, and that in respect of his other warlike achievements he was no whit behind him. So that bursting with jealousy, and unable to remain at rest by reason of the other's renown, and seeing no way to sow discord among the fathers, he set himself to spread abroad sinister reports among the commons, throwing out among other charges that the treasure collected to be given to the Gauls, but which was afterwards withheld, had been embezzled by certain citizens, and if recovered, might be turned to public uses in relieving the people from taxes or from private debts. These assertions so prevailed with the commons that they began to hold meetings and to raise what tumults they liked throughout the city. But this displeasing the Senate, and the matter appearing to them grave and dangerous, they appointed a dictator to inquire into it and to restrain the attacks of Manius. The dictator forthwith caused Manius to be cited before him, and these two were thus brought face to face in the presence of the whole city, the dictator surrounded by the nobles, and Manius by the commons. The latter being desired to say with whom the treasure of which he had spoken was to be found, since the Senate were as anxious to know this as the commons, made no direct reply, but answered evasively that it was needless to tell them what they already knew. Whereupon the dictator ordered him to prison. In this passage we are taught how hateful a thing it is to calumny in all free states, as indeed in every society, and how we must neglect no means which may serve to check it. And there can be no more effectual means for checking calumny than by affording ample facilities for impeachment,
which is as useful in a commonwealth as the other is pernicious. And between them there is this difference, that calumny needs neither witness nor circumstantial proof to establish it, so that any man may be calumniated by any other, but not impeached, since impeachment demands that there be substantive charges made and trustworthy evidence to support them. Again, it is before the magistrates, the people, or the courts of justice that men are impeached, but in the streets and marketplaces that they are calumniated. Calumny, therefore, is most rife in that state wherein impeachment is least practiced, and the laws least favor it. For which reasons the legislator should so shape the laws of his state that it shall be possible therein to impeach any of its citizens without fear or favor, and, after duly providing for this, should visit calumniators with the sharpest punishments. Those punished will have no cause to complain, since it was in their power to have impeached openly where they have secretly calumniated. Where this is not seen to, grave disorders will always ensue, for calumnies sting without disabling, and those who are stung being more moved by hatred of their detractors than by fear of the things they say against them, seek revenge. This matter, as we have said, was well arranged for in Rome, but has always been badly regulated in our city of Florence. And as the Roman ordinances with regard to it were productive of much good, so the want of them in Florence has bred much mischief. For anyone reading the history of our city may perceive how many calumnies have at all times been aimed against those of its citizens who have taken a leading part in its affairs. Thus, of one it would be said that he had plundered the public treasury, of another that he had failed in some enterprise because he had been bribed, of a third that this or the other disaster had originated in his ambition. Hence hatred sprang up on every side, and hatred growing to division, these led to factions, and these again to ruin. But had there existed in Florence some procedure whereby citizens might have been impeached and calumniators punished, numberless disorders which have taken place there would have been prevented. For citizens who were impeached, whether condemned or acquitted, would have no power to injure the state, and they would have been impeached far seldomer than they have been calumniated. For calumny, as I have said already, is an easier matter than impeachment. Some indeed have used calumny as a means for raising themselves to power, and have found their advantage in traducing eminent citizens who withstood their designs, for by taking the part of the people and confirming them in their ill opinion of these great men, they made them their friends. Of this, though I could give many instances, I shall content myself with one. At the siege of Lucca, the Florentine army was commanded by Messer Giovanni Guiccinardi as its commissary,
through whose bad generalship or ill fortune the town was not taken. But whatever the cause of this failure, Messer Giovanni had the blame, and the rumor ran that he had been bribed by the people of Lucca, which calumny being fostered by his enemies, brought Messer Giovanni to the very verge of despair, and, though to clear himself he would willingly have given himself up to the captain of justice, he found he could not, there being no provision in the laws of the Republic which allowed of his doing so. Hence arose the bitterest hostility between the friends of Messer Giovanni, who were mostly of the old nobility, and those who sought to reform the government of Florence. And from this and the like causes, the affair grew to such dimensions as to bring about the downfall of our Republic. Manlius Capitolinus, then, was a calumniator, not an accuser, and in their treatment of him the Romans showed how calumniators should be dealt with, by which I mean that they should be forced to become accusers, and if their accusation be proved true, should be rewarded, or at least not punished, but if proved false, should be punished as Manlius was.
Chapter 9. That to give new institutions to a commonwealth, or to reconstruct old institutions on an entirely new basis, must be the work of one man. It may perhaps be thought that I should not have gotten so far into the history of Rome without some mention of those who gave that city its institutions, and saying something of these institutions themselves, so far as they relate to religion and war. As I have no wish to keep those who would know my views on these matters in suspense, I say at once that to many it might seem of evil omen that the founder of a civil government like Romulus should first have slain his brother, and afterwards have consented to the death of Titus Tatius, the Sabine, whom he had chosen to be his colleague in the kingship, since his countrymen, if moved by ambition and lust for power to inflict like injuries on any who opposed their designs, might plead the example of their prince. This view would be a reasonable one were we to disregard the object which led Romulus to put those men to death. But we must take it as a rule to which there are very few, if any, exceptions, that no commonwealth or kingdom ever has salutary institutions given it from the first, or has its institutions recast in an entirely new mold, unless by a single person. On the contrary, it must be from one man that it receives its institutions at first, and upon one man that all similar reconstruction must depend. Therefore, the wise founder of a commonwealth, who seeks to benefit not only himself or the line of his descendants, but his state and country, must endeavor to acquire an absolute and undivided authority. And none who is wise will ever blame any action, however extraordinary and irregular, which serves to lay the foundation of a kingdom or to establish a republic. For although the act condemn the doer, the end may justify him. And when, as in the case of Romulus, the end is good, it will always excuse the means, since it is he who does violence with intent to injure, not he who does it with the design to secure tranquility, who merits blame. Such a person ought, however, to be so prudent and moderate as to avoid transmitting the absolute authority he acquires as an inheritance to another. For as men are by nature more prone to evil than to good, a successor may turn to ambitious ends the power which his predecessor has used to promote worthy ends. And moreover, though it be one man that must give a state its institutions, once given, they are not so likely to last long resting for support on the shoulders of one man only, as when entrusted to the care of many, and when it is the business of many to maintain them. For though the multitude be unfit to set a state in order, since they cannot, by reason of the divisions which prevail among them, agree wherein the true well-being of the state lies, yet they have once been taught the truth, they never will consent to abandon it. And that Romulus, though he put his brother to death, is yet of those who are to be pardoned, since what he did was done for the common good, and not from personal ambition,
is shown by his at once creating a Senate with whom he took counsel, and in accordance with the voice of whom he determined. And whoever shall well examine the authority which Romulus reserved for himself will find that he reserved nothing beyond the command of the army when war was resolved, and the right to assemble the Senate. This is seen later, on Rome becoming free by the expulsion of the Tarquins, when the Romans altered none of their ancient institutions, saving in appointing 2 consuls for a year instead of a king for life. For this proves that all the original institutions of that city were more in conformity with a free and constitutional government than with an absolute and despotic one. In support of what has been said above, I might cite innumerable instances, as of Moses, Lycurgus, Solon, and other founders of kingdoms and commonwealths, who, from the full powers given them, were enabled to shape their laws to the public advantage. But passing over these examples, as of common notoriety, I take one, not indeed so famous, but which merits the attention of all who desire to frame wise laws. Agis, king of Sparta, desiring to bring back his countrymen to those limits within which the laws of Lycurgus had held them, because he thought that, from having somewhat divided from them, his city had lost much of its ancient virtue, and, consequently, much of its strength and power, was at the very outset of his attempts slain by the Spartan Ephyri, as one who sought to make himself a tyrant. But Cleomenes, coming after him in the kingdom, and, on reading the notes and writings which he found of Agis, in which his designs and intentions were explained, being stirred by the same desire, perceived that he could not confer this benefit to his country unless he obtained sole power. For he saw that the ambition of others made it impossible for him to do what was useful for many against the will of a few. Wherefore, finding fit occasion, he caused the Ephyri and all others likely to throw obstacles in his way to be put to death, after which he completely renewed the laws of Lycurgus. And the result of his measures would have been to give fresh life to Sparta, and to gain for himself a renown not inferior to that of Lycurgus, had it not been for the power of the Macedonians and the weakness of the other Greek states. For while engaged with these reforms, he was attacked by the Macedonians, and being by himself no match for them, and having none to whom he could turn for help, he was overpowered, and his plans, though wise and praiseworthy, were never brought to perfection. All which circumstances considered, I conclude that he who gives new institutions to a state must stand alone, and that for the deaths of Remus and Tatius, Romulus is to be excused rather than blamed. Chapter 10. That in proportion as the founder of a kingdom or commonwealth merits praise, he who founds a tyranny deserves blame. Of all who are praised, they are praised the most who are the authors and founders of religions, after whom come the founders of kingdoms and commonwealths. Next to these, they have the greatest name, who as commanders of armies have added to their own dominions or those of their country. After these, again, are ranked men of letters, who, being of various shades of merit, are celebrated each in their degree. To all others, whose number is infinite, is ascribed that measure of praise to which his profession or occupation entitles him. And conversely, all who contribute to the overthrow of religion or to the ruin of kingdoms and commonwealths, all who are foes to letters and to the arts that confer honor and benefit to the human race, among whom I reckon the impious, the cruel, the ignorant, the indolent, the base, and the worthless, are held in infamy and detestation. No one, whether he be wise or foolish, bad or good, if asked to choose between these two kinds of men, will ever be found to withhold praise from what deserves praise, or blame from what is to be blamed. And yet almost all, deceived by a false good and a false glory, allow themselves, either ignorantly or willfully, to follow in the footsteps of such as deserve blame rather than praise. and have it in their power to establish to their lasting renown a commonwealth or kingdom, turn aside to create a tyranny without a thought how much they thereby lose in name, fame, security, tranquility, and peace of mind, and, in name, how much infamy, scorn, danger, and disquiet are incurred. But were they to read history and turn to profit the lessons of the past, it seems impossible that those living in a republic as private citizens should not prefer their native city to play the part of Scipio rather than Caesar, or that those who by good fortune or merit have risen to be rulers should not seek rather to resemble Agesilaus, Timoleon, and Dion than Nobis, Phalaris, and Dionysus, since they would see how the latter are loaded with infamy, while the former have been extolled beyond bounds. And they would see, too, how Timoleon and others like him had in their country as great an authority as Dionysus or Phalaris in their own, while enjoying far greater security. Nor let anyone finding Caesar celebrated
by a crowd of writers be misled by his glory. For those who praise him have been corrupted by good fortune and overawed by the greatness of that empire, which being governed in his name would not suffer any to speak their minds openly concerning him. But let him who desires to know how historians would have written of Caesar had they been free to declare their thoughts, mark what they say of Catiline, than whom Caesar is more hateful, in proportion as he who does is more to be condemned than he who only desires to do evil. Let him see also what praises they lavish upon Brutus, because, being unable, out of respect for his power, to reproach Caesar, they magnify his enemy. And if he who has become prince in any state will but reflect how after Rome was made an empire, far greater praise was earned those emperors who lived within the laws, and worthily, than by those who lived in the contrary way, he will see that Titus, Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus, and Marcus had no need of praetorian cohorts or of countless legions to guard them, but were defended by their own good lives, the goodwill of their subjects, and the attachment of the Senate. In like manner, he will perceive in the case of Caligula, Nero, Vitellius, and ever so many other of those evil emperors, that all the armies of the East and West were of no avail to protect them from the enemies whom their bad and depraved lives raised up against them. And were the history of these emperors rightly studied, it would be a sufficient lesson to any prince how to distinguish the paths which lead to honor and safety from those which end in shame and insecurity. For of the 26 emperors from Caesar to Maximine, 16 came to a violent death, 10 only to a natural one. And though 1 or 2 of those who died by violence may have been good princes, as Galba or Pertinax, they met their fate in consequence of that corruption which their predecessors had left behind in the army. And if among those who died a natural death there be found some bad emperors, like Severus, it is to be ascribed to their signal good fortune and to their great abilities, advantages seldom found united in the same man. From the study of this history we may also learn how a good government is to be established, for while all the emperors who succeeded to the throne by birth, except Titus, were bad, all were good who succeeded by adoption, as in the case of the 5 from Nerva to Marcus. But so soon as the empire fell once more to the heirs by birth, its ruin recommenced. Let a prince therefore look to the period which extends from Nerva to Marcus, and contrast it with that which went before, and that which came after, and then let him say in which of them he would have wished to have been born or to have reigned. For during these times in which good men governed, he will see the prince secure in the midst of happy subjects, and the whole world filled with peace and justice. He will find the Senate maintaining its authority, the magistrates enjoying their honors, rich citizens their wealth, rank and merit held in respect, ease and content everywhere prevailing, rancor, license, corruption, and ambition everywhere quenched, and that golden age restored, in which everyone might hold and support what opinions he pleased. He will see, in short, the world triumphing, the sovereign honored and revered, the people animated with love, and rejoicing in their security.
But should he turn to examine the times of the other emperors, he will find them wasted by battles, torn by seditions, cruel either in war or in peace, many princes perishing by the sword, many wars foreign and domestic, Italy overwhelmed with unheard-of disasters, its towns destroyed and plundered, Rome burned, the capital razed to the ground by Roman citizens, the ancient temples desolated, the ceremonies of religion corrupted, the cities rank with adultery, the seas covered with exiles, and the islands polluted with blood. He will see outrage follow outrage, rank, riches, honors, and above all virtue imputed as mortal crimes, informers rewarded, slaves bribed to betray their masters, freedmen their patrons, and those who were without enemies brought to destruction by their friends. And then he will know the true nature of the debt that Rome, Italy, and the world owe to Caesar, and if he possesses a spark of human feeling, will turn from the example of those evil times and kindle with a consuming passion to imitate those which were good. And in truth, the prince who seeks for worldly glory should desire to be the ruler of a corrupt city, not that, like Caesar, he may destroy it, but that, like Romulus, he may restore it, since man cannot hope for, nor heaven offer, any better opportunity of fame. Were it indeed necessary in giving a constitution to a state to forfeit its sovereignty, the prince who, to retain his station, should withhold a constitution might plead excuse. But for him who in giving a constitution can still retain his sovereignty, no excuse is to be made. Let therefore those to whom heaven has afforded this opportunity remember that two courses lie open to them, one which will render them secure while they live and glorious when they die, another which exposes them to continual difficulties in life and condemns them to eternal infamy after death.
Chapter 11. Of the Religion of the Romans. Though Rome had Romulus for her first founder, and as a daughter owed her her being and nurture, nevertheless, when the institutions of Romulus were seen by heaven to be insufficient for so great a state, the Roman Senate were moved to choose Numa Pompilius as his successor, that he might look to all matters which Romulus had neglected. He, finding the people fierce and turbulent, and desiring with the help of the peaceful arts to bring them to order and obedience, called in the aid of religion as essential to the maintenance of civil society, and gave it such a form that for many ages God was nowhere so much feared as in that republic. The effect of this was to render easy any enterprise in which the Senate or great men of Rome thought fit to engage. And whosoever pays heed to an infinity of actions performed sometimes by the Roman people collectively, often by single citizens, will see that, esteeming the power of God beyond that of man, they dreaded far more to violate their oath than to transgress the laws, as is clearly shown by the examples of Scipio and of Mammius Torquatus. For after the defeat of the Romans by Hannibal at Cannae, many citizens meeting together resolved in their terror and dismay to abandon Italy and seek refuge in Sicily. But Scipio, getting word of this, went among them, and menacing them with his naked sword, made them swear never to abandon their country. Again, when Lucius Manlius was accused by the tribune Marcus Pomponius before the day fixed for trial, Titus Manlius, afterwards named Torquatus, son of Lucius, went to seek this Marcus, and threatening him with death if he did not withdraw the charge against his father, compelled him to swear compliance, and he, through fear, having sworn, kept his oath. In the first of these two instances, therefore, citizens whom love of their country and its laws could not have retained in Italy were kept there by the oath forced upon them. And in the second, the tribune Marcus, to keep his oath, laid aside the hatred he bore the father, and overlooked the injury done him by the son and his own dishonor. And this from no other cause than the religion which Numa had impressed upon this city.
And it will be plain to anyone who carefully studies Roman history how much religion helped in disciplining the army, in uniting the people, in keeping good men good, and putting bad men to shame, so that had it to be decided to which prince, Romulus or Numa, Rome owed the greater debt, I think the balance must turn in favor of Numa. For when religion is once established, you may readily bring in arms, but where you have arms without religion, it is not easy afterwards to bring in religion. We see, too, that while Romulus, in order to create a senate and to establish his other ordinances, civil and military, needed no support from divine authority, this was very necessary to Numa, who feigned to have intercourse with a nymph by whose advice he was guided in counseling the people. And this because, desiring to introduce in Rome new and untried institutions, he feared that his own authority might not effect his end. Nor, indeed, has any attempt ever been made to introduce unusual laws among a people without resorting to divine authority, since without such sanction they never would have been accepted. For the wise recognize many things to be good, which do not bear such reasons on their face as command their acceptance by others. Wherefore, wise men who would obviate these difficulties have resort to divine aid. Thus did Lycurgus, thus did Solon, and thus have done many besides, who have had the same end in view. The Romans, accordingly, admiring the prudence and virtues of Numa, assented to all the measures which he recommended. This, however, is to be said, that the circumstance of these times being deeply tinctured with religious feeling, and of the men with whom he had to deal being rude and ignorant, gave Numa better facility to carry out his plans, as enabling him to mold his subjects readily to any new impression. And doubtless he who should seek at this present day to form a new commonwealth would find the task easier among a race of simple mountaineers than among the dwellers of cities, where society is corrupt. As the sculptor can easily carve a fair statue from a rough block than from the block which has been badly shaped out by another. But taking all this into account, I maintain that the religion introduced by Numa was one of the chief causes of the prosperity of Rome, since it gave rise to good ordinances, which in turn brought with them good fortune, and with good fortune happy issues to whatsoever was undertaken. And as the observance of the ordinances of religion is the cause of the greatness of a state, so their neglect is the occasion of its decline, since a kingdom without the fear of God must either fall apart or be maintained by the fear of some prince who supplies that influence not supplied by religion. But since the lives of princes are short, the life of this prince also, and with it his influence, must soon come to an end. Whence it happens that a kingdom which rests wholly on the qualities of its prince lasts for a brief time only, because these qualities, terminating with his life, are rarely renewed in his successor. For, as Dante wisely says, "Seldom through the boughs does human worth renew itself, for such the will of him who gives it, that we may ascribe it to him." It follows, therefore, that the safety of a commonwealth or kingdom lies not in it having a ruler who governs it prudently while he lives, but in it having one who so orders things that when he dies the state may still maintain itself. And though it is easier to impose new institutions or a new faith on rude and simple men, it is not therefore impossible to persuade them their adoption by men who are civilized and who do not think themselves rude. The people of Florence do not esteem themselves rude or ignorant, and yet were persuaded by the friar Girolamo Savonarola that he spoke with God. Whether in this he said truth or no, I take not on myself to pronounce, since of so great a man we must speak with reverence. But this I do say, that very many believed him without having witnessed anything extraordinary to warrant their belief, his life, his doctrines, the matter whereof he treated, being sufficient to enlist their faith. Let no man, therefore, lose heart from thinking that he cannot do what others have done before him. For, as I said in my preface, men are born and live and die, always in accordance with the same rules.
Chapter 12. That it is of much moment to make account of religion, and that Italy, through the Roman Church, being wanting therein, has been ruined. Princes and commonwealths that would save themselves from growing corrupted should before all things keep uncorrupted the rites and ceremonies of religion, and always hold them in reverence, since we can have no surer sign of the decay of a province than to see divine worship held therein in contempt. This is easily understood when it is seen on what foundation that religion rests in which a man is born. For every religion has its root in certain fundamental ordinances peculiar to itself. The religion of the Gentiles had its beginning in the responses of the oracles and in the prognostics of the augurs and soothsayers. All their other ceremonies and observances depended upon these, because men naturally believed that the God who could forecast their future weal or woe could also bring them to pass. Wherefore the temples, the prayers, the sacrifices, and all the other rites of their worship had their origin in this, that the oracles of Delos, of Dodona, and others celebrated in antiquity, held the world admiring and devout. But afterwards, when these oracles began to shape their answers to suit the interests of powerful men, and their impostures to be seen through by the multitude, men grew incredulous and ready to overturn every sacred institution. For which reason, the rulers of kingdoms and commonwealths should maintain the foundations of the faith that they hold, since thus it will be easy for them to keep their country religious, and consequently virtuous and united. To which end they should countenance and further whatsoever tells in favor of religion, even should they think it untrue. And the wiser they are, and the better they are acquainted with natural causes, the more ought they to do so. It is from this course having been followed by the wise, that the miracles celebrated even in false religions have come to be held in repute. For from whatever source they spring, discreet men will extol them, whose authority afterwards gives them currency everywhere. These miracles were common enough in Rome, and among others this was believed, that when the Roman soldiers were sacking the city of Veii, certain of them entered the temple of Juno and spoke to the statue of the goddess, saying, "Wilt thou come with us to Rome?" When to some it seemed that she inclined her head in assent, and to others that they heard her answer, "Yea." For these men, being filled with religious awe, which Titius Livius shows us by the circumstance that in entering the temple they entered devoutly, reverently, and without tumult, persuaded themselves they heard that answer to their question, which perhaps they had formed beforehand in their minds. But their faith and belief were wholly approved and confirmed by Camillus and by the other chief men of the city. Had religion been maintained among the princes of Christendom on the footing on which it was established by its founder, the Christian states and republics had been far more united and far more prosperous than they now are. Nor can we have surer proof of its decay than in witnessing how those countries which are the nearest neighbors of the Roman Church, the head of our faith, have less devoutness than any others, so that anyone who considers its earliest beginnings and observes how widely different is its present practice might well believe its ruin or its chastisement to be close at hand. But since some are of the opinion that the welfare of Italy depends on the Church of Rome, I desire to put forward certain arguments that occur to me against that view,
and shall adduce two very strong ones, which to my mind admit no answer. The first is, that through the ill example of the Roman court, the country has lost all religious feeling and devoutness, a loss which draws after it infinite mischiefs and disorders. For as the presence of religion implies every excellence, so the contrary is involved in its absence. To the Church, therefore, and to the priests, we Italians owe this first debt, that through them we have become wicked and irreligious. And a still greater debt we owe them for what is the immediate cause of our ruin, namely, that by the Church our country is kept divided. For no country was ever united or prosperous which did not yield obedience to some one prince or commonwealth, as has been the case with France and Spain. And the Church is the sole cause why Italy stands on a different footing and is subject to no one king or commonwealth. For though it holds here her seat and exerts her temporal authority, she has never yet gained strength and courage to seize upon the entire country, or make herself supreme. Yet never has been so weak that when in fear of losing her temporal dominion, could not call in some foreign potentate to aid her against any Italian state by which she was overmatched, of which we find many instances both in early times, as when by the intervention of Charles the Great she drove the Lombards, who had made themselves masters of nearly the whole country, out of Italy, and also in recent times, as when, with the help of France, she first stripped the Venetians of their territories, and then with the help of the Swiss expelled the French. The Church, therefore, never being powerful enough herself to take possession of the entire country, while at the same time preventing anyone else from doing so, has made it impossible to bring Italy under one head, and has been the cause of her always living subject to many princes or rulers, by whom she has been brought to such division and weakness as to have become a prey not to barbarian kings only, but to any who have thought it fit to attack her. For this, I say, we Italians have none to thank but the Church. And were any man powerful enough to transplant the court of Rome, with all the authority it now wields over the rest of Italy, into the territories of the Swiss, the only people who at this day, both as regards religion and military discipline, live like the ancients, he would have clear proof of the truth of what I affirm, and would find that the corrupt manners of that court had in a little while wrought greater mischief in these territories than any other disaster which could ever befall them.
Chapter 13. Of the use the Romans made of religion in giving institutions to their city, in carrying out their enterprises, and in quelling tumults. Here it seems to me not out of place to cite instances of the Romans seeking assistance from religion in reforming their institutions and in carrying out their warlike designs. And although many such are related by Titus Livius, I content myself with mentioning the following only. The Romans, having appointed tribunes with consular powers, all of them, save one, plebeians, it so chanced that in that very year they were visited by a plague and famine, accompanied by many strange portents. Taking occasion from this, the nobles, at the next creation of tribunes, gave out that the gods were angry with Rome for lowering the majesty of her government, nor could be appeased but by the choice of tribunes being restored to a fair footing. Whereupon the people, smitten with religious awe, chose all the tribunes from the nobles. Again, at the siege of Veii, we find the Roman commanders making use of religion to keep the minds of their men well disposed towards that enterprise. For in the last year of the siege, the soldiers, disgusted with their protracted service, began to clamor to be led back to Rome, on the Alban Lake suddenly rising to an uncommon height,
and it was found that the oracles at Delphi and elsewhere had foretold that Veii should fall that year in which the Alban lake overflowed. The hope of near victory thus excited in the minds of the soldiers led them to put up with the weariness of the war and to continue in arms, until Camillus being named dictator, Veii was taken after a 10-year siege. In these cases, therefore, we see religion, wisely used, assist in the reduction of this city, and in restoring the tribuneship to the nobles, neither of which ends could well have been effected without it. One other example bearing on the same subject I must not omit. Constant disturbances were occasioned in Rome by the tribune Terentilis, who for reasons to be noticed in their place sought to pass a certain law. The nobles, in their efforts to baffle him, had recourse to religion, which they sought to turn to account in two ways. For first, they caused the Sibylline books to be searched, and a feigned answer returned, that in that year the city ran great risk of losing its freedom through civil discord, which fraud, although exposed by the tribunes, nevertheless aroused such alarm in the minds of the commons that they slackened in their support of their leaders. Their other contrivance was as follows. A certain Appius Herdonius, at the head of a band of slaves and outlaws, to the number of 4,000, having seized the capital by night, an alarm was spread, that were the Equians and Volscians, those perpetual enemies of the Roman name, then to attack the city, they might succeed in taking it. And when, in spite of this, the tribunes stubbornly persisted in their efforts to pass the law, declaring the act of Herdonius to be a device of the nobles and no real danger, Publius Rubetius, a citizen of weight and authority, came forth from the Senate house and, in parts friendly and parts menacing, showed them the peril in which the city stood, and that their demands were unseasonable, and spoke to such effect that the commons bound themselves by an oath to stand by the consul, in fulfillment of which engagement they aided the consul, Publius Valerius, to carry the capital by assault. But Valerius being slain in the attack, Titus Quintius was at once appointed in his place, who, to leave the people no breathing time, nor suffer their thoughts to revert to the Terentilian law, ordered them to quit Rome and march against the Volscians, declaring them bound to follow him by virtue of the oath they had sworn not to desert the consul. And though the tribunes withstood him, contending that the oath had been sworn to the dead consul and not to Quintius, yet the people, under the influence of religious awe, chose rather to obey the consul than believe the tribunes. And Titus Livius commends their behavior when he says, "That neglect of the gods which now prevails had not then made its way, and was not then the practice for every man to interpret his oath or the laws to suit his private ends." The tribunes, accordingly, fearing to lose their entire ascendancy, consented to obey the consul and to refrain for a year from moving in the matter of the Terentilian law, while the consuls, on their part, undertook that for a year the commons should not be called forth to war. And thus, with the help of religion, the Senate were able to overcome a difficulty which they never could have overcome without it. Chapter 14. That the Romans interpreted the auspices to meet the occasion, and made a prudent show of observing the rites of religion even when forced to disregard them, and any who rashly slighted religion they punished. Auguries were not only, as we have shown above, a main foundation of the old religion of the Gentiles, but were also the cause of the prosperity of the Roman Commonwealth. Accordingly, the Romans gave more heed to these than to any other of their observances, resorting to them in their consular comitia, in undertaking new enterprises, in calling out their armies, in going into battle, and in short, in every business of importance, whether civil or military. Nor would they ever set forth on any warlike expedition until they had satisfied their soldiers that the gods had promised them victory. Among other means of declaring the auguries, they had in their armies a class of soothsayers named by them Pulari, whom, when they desired to give battle, they would ask to take the auspices, which they did by observing the behavior of fowls. If the fowls pecked, the engagement was begun with a favorable omen. If they refused, battle was declined. Nevertheless, when it was plain on the face of it that a certain course had to be taken, they take it at all hazards, even though the auspices were adverse, contriving, however, to manage matters so adroitly as not to appear to throw any slight on religion, as was done by the consul Papirius in the great battle he fought with the Samnites, wherein that nation was finally broken and overthrown. For Papirius, being encamped over against the Samnites, and perceiving that if he fought, victory was certain, and consequently being eager to engage, desired the almonds to be taken. The fowls refused to peck. But the chief soothsayer, observing the eagerness of the soldiers to fight, and the confidence felt both by them and by their captain, not to deprive the army of such an opportunity of glory, reported to the consul that the auspices were favorable, whereupon Papirius began to array his army for battle. But some among the soothsayers having divulged to certain of the soldiers that the fowls had not pecked, this was told to Spurius Papirius, the nephew of the consul, who, reporting it to his uncle, the latter straightway bade him mind his own business, for that so far as he himself and the army were concerned, the auspices were fair, and if the soothsayer had lied, the consequences were on his head. And that the event might accord with the prognostics, he commanded his officers to place the soothsayers in front of the battle. It so happened that as they advanced against the enemy, the chief soothsayer was killed by a spear thrown by a Roman soldier, which the consul hearing of, said, "All goes well, and as the gods would have it. For by the death of this liar, the army is purged from blame and absolved from any displeasure these may have conceived." And contriving in this way to make his designs tally with the auspices, he joined battle, without the army knowing that the ordinances of religion had in any degree been disregarded. But an opposite course was taken by Appius Pulcher in Sicily, in the first Carthaginian war. For desiring to join battle, he bade the soothsayers take the auspices, and on their announcing that the fowls refused to feed, he answered, "Let us see, then, whether they will drink," and so saying, caused them to be thrown into the sea. After which he fought and was defeated. For this he was condemned at Rome, while Papirius was honored, not so much because the one had gained while the other had lost a battle, as because in their treatment of the auspices the one had behaved discreetly, the other with rashness. And in truth, the only object of this system of taking the auspices was to ensure the army joining battle with that confidence of success which constantly leads to victory, a device followed not only by the Romans, but also by foreign nations, of which I shall give an example in the following chapter.
Chapter 15. How the Samnites, as a last recourse in their broken fortunes, had recourse to religion. The Samnites, who before had met with many defeats at the hands of the Romans, were at last decisively routed by them in Etruria, where their armies were cut to pieces and their commanders slain. And because their allies, such as the Etruscans, the Umbrians, and the Gauls, were likewise vanquished, they could now, as Livius tells us, neither trust to their own strength nor to foreign aid. Yet for all that, would not cease from hostilities, nor resign themselves to forfeit the liberty which they had unsuccessfully defended, preferring new defeats to an inglorious submission. They therefore resolved to make a final effort, and as they knew that victory was only to be secured by inspiring their soldiers with a stubborn courage, to which end nothing could help so much as religion, at the instance of their high priest, Ulvius Pactus, they revived an ancient sacrificial rite, performed by them in the following manner. After offering solemn sacrifice, they caused all the captains of their armies, standing between the slain victims and the smoking altars, to swear never to abandon the war. They then summoned the common soldiers one by one, and before the same altars, and surrounded by a ring of many centurions with drawn swords,
first bound them by oath never to reveal what they might see or hear, and then, after imprecating the divine wrath and reciting the most terrible incantations, made them vow and swear to the gods, as they would not have a curse light on their race and offspring, to follow wherever their captains led, never to turn back from battle, and to put any they saw turn back to death. Some who, in their terror, declined to swear, were forthwith slain by the centurions. The rest, warned by their cruel fate, complied. Assembling thereafter to the number of 40,000, one half of whom, to render their appearance of unusual splendor, were clad in white with plumes and crests over their helmets, they took up their ground in the neighborhood of Aquilonia. But Papyrus, being sent against them, bade his soldiers be of good cheer, telling them that feathers made no wounds, and that a Roman spear would pierce a painted shield. And to lessen the effect which the oath taken by the Samnites had upon the minds of the Romans, he said that such an oath must rather distract than strengthen those bound by it, since they had to fear at once their enemies, their comrades, and their gods. In the battle that ensued, the Samnites were routed, any firmness lent them by religion or the oath they had sworn, being balanced by the Roman valor and the terror inspired by past defeats. Still, we see that in their own judgment they had no other refuge to which to turn, nor other remedy for restoring their broken hopes. And this is strong testimony to the spirit religion rightly used can arouse. Some of the incidents which I have now been considering may be thought to relate rather to the foreign than to the domestic affairs of Rome, which last alone form the proper subject of this book. Nevertheless, since the matter connects itself with one of the most important institutions of the Roman Republic, I have thought it convenient to notice it here, so as not to divide the subject and be obliged to return to it hereafter. Chapter 16. That a people accustomed to live under a prince, if by any accident become free, can hardly preserve that freedom. Should a people accustomed to live under a prince by any accident become free, as did the Romans on the expulsion of the Tarquins, we know from numberless instances recorded in ancient history how hard it will be for it to maintain that freedom. And this is no more than we might expect, for a people in such circumstances may be likened to the wild animal, which, though destined by nature to roam at large in the woods, has been reared in the cage and in constant confinement, and which, should it chance to be set free in the open country, being unused to find its own food and unfamiliar with the coverts where it might lie concealed, falls a prey to the first who seeks to recapture it. Even thus it fares with the people which has been accustomed to be governed by others, since ignorant how to act by itself, either for attack or defense, and nor knowing foreign princes, nor being known of them, is speedily brought back under the yoke, and often under a heavier yoke than that from which it has just freed its neck. These difficulties will be met with even where the great body of the citizens has not become wholly corrupted, but where the corruption is complete, freedom, as shall presently be shown, is not merely fleeting, but impossible. Wherefore, my remarks are to be taken as applying only to those states wherein corruption has as yet made no great progress, and in which there is more that is sound than unsound. To the difficulties above noticed, another has to be added, which is that a state in becoming free makes for itself bitter enemies, but not warm friends. All become its bitter enemies, who, drawing their support from the wealth of the tyrant, flourished under his government. For these men, when the causes which made them powerful are withdrawn, can no longer live contented, and are one and all impelled to attempt the restoration of the tyranny, in hopes of regaining their former importance. On the other hand, as I have said, the state which becomes free does not gain for itself warm friends. For a free government bestows its honors and rewards in accordance with certain fixed rules and on considerations of merit, without which none is honored or rewarded. But when a man obtains only those honors or rewards which he seems to himself to deserve, he will never admit that he is under any obligation to those who bestow them. Moreover, the common benefits that all derive from a free government, which consist in the power to enjoy what is our own, openly and undisturbed, in having to feel no anxiety for the honor of wife or child, nor any fear for personal safety, are hardly recognized by men while they still possess them, since none will ever confess obligation to him who merely refrains from injury. For these reasons, I repeat, a state which has recently become free is likely to have bitter enemies and no warm friends. Now, to meet these difficulties and their attendant disorders, there is no more potent, effectual, wholesome, and necessary remedy than to slay the sons of Brutus. They, as the historian tells us, were along with other young Romans led to conspire against their country, simply because the unusual privileges which they had enjoyed under the kings were withheld under the consuls, so that to them it seemed as though the freedom of the people implied their servitude. Anyone, therefore, who undertakes to control a people, either as their prince or as the head of a commonwealth, and does not make sure work with all who are hostile to his new institutions, founds a government which cannot last long. Undoubtedly, those princes are to be reckoned unhappy, who, to secure their position, are forced to advance by unusual and irregular paths, and with the people for their enemies. For while he who has to deal with a few adversaries only can easily and without much or serious difficulty secure himself, he who has an entire people against him can never feel safe, and the greater the severity he uses, the weaker his authority becomes, so that his best course is to strive to make the people his friends. But since these views may seem to conflict with what I have said above, treating there of a republic and here of a prince, that I may not have to return to the subject again, I will in this place discuss it briefly. Speaking then of those princes who have become the tyrants of their country, I say that the prince who seeks to gain over an unfriendly people should first of all examine what it is the people really desire, and he will always find that they desire two things. First, to be revenged upon those who are the cause of their servitude, and second, to regain their freedom. The first of these desires the prince can gratify wholly, the second in part. As regards the former, we have an instance exactly in point. Clearchus, tyrant of Heraclea, being in exile, it so happened that on a feud arising between the commons and the nobles of that city, the latter, perceiving they were weaker than their adversaries, began to look with favor to Clearchus, and conspiring with him, in opposition to the popular voice, recalled him to Heraclea, and deprived the people of their freedom. Clearchus, finding himself thus placed between the arrogance of the nobles, whom he could in no way either satisfy or correct, and the fury of the people, who could not put up with the loss of their freedom, resolved to rid himself at a stroke from the harassment of the nobles, and recommend himself to the people. Wherefore, watching his opportunity, he caused all the nobles to be put to death, and thus, to the extreme delight of the people, satisfied one of those desires by which they are possessed, namely, the desire for revenge. As for the other desire of the people, namely, to recover their freedom, the prince, since he can never content them in this, should examine what the causes are which make them long to be free. And he will find a very few of them desiring freedom that they may obtain power, but all the rest, whose number is countless, only desiring it that they may live securely. For in all republics, whatever their form of government, barely 40 or 50 citizens have any place in the direction of affairs, who, from their number being so small, can be easily reckoned with, either by making away with them, or by allowing them such a share of honors as, looking to their position, may reasonably content them. All those others, whose sole aim it is to live safely, are well contented where the prince enacts such laws and ordinances that provide for the general security, while they establish his own authority. And he who does this, and the people see that nothing induces him to violate these laws, they soon begin to live happily and without anxiety. Of this we have an example in the kingdom of France, which enjoys perfect security from this cause alone, that its kings are bound to compliance with an infinity of laws, upon which the well-being of the whole people depends. And he who gave this state its constitution allowed its kings to do as they pleased as regards arms and money, but provided that as regards everything else they should not interfere save as the laws might direct. Those rulers, therefore, who omit to provide sufficiently for the safety of their government at the outset must, like the Romans, do so on the first occasion which offers. And whoever lets the occasion slip will repent too late of not having acted as he should. The Romans, however, being still uncorrupted at the time when they recovered their freedom, were able, after slaying the sons of Brutus and getting rid of the Tarquins, to maintain it with all those safeguards and remedies which we have elsewhere considered. But had they already become corrupted, no remedy could have been found, either in Rome or out of it, by which their freedom could have been secured, as I shall show in the following chapter.
Chapter 17. That a corrupt people, obtaining freedom, can hardly preserve it. I believe that if her kings had not been expelled, Rome must very soon have become a weak and inconsiderable state. Foreseeing to what a pitch of corruption these kings had come, we may conjecture that if 2 or 3 more like reigns had followed, and the taint spread from the head to the members, so soon as the latter became infected, cure would have been hopeless. But from the head being removed while the trunk was still sound, it was not difficult for the Romans to return to a free and constitutional government. It may be assumed, however, as most certain, that a corrupt city living under a prince can never recover its freedom, even were the prince and all his line to be exterminated. For in such a city it must necessarily happen that one prince will be replaced by another, and that things will never settle down until a new lord be established, unless indeed the combined goodness and valor of some one citizen should maintain freedom, which even then will endure only for his lifetime, as happened twice in Syracuse, first under the rule of Dion, and again under that of Timoleon, whose virtues while they lived kept their city free, but on whose death it fell once more under a tyranny. But the strongest example that can be given is that of Rome, which, on the expulsion of the Tarquins, was able at once to seize on liberty and to maintain it. Yet on the deaths of Caesar, Caligula, and Nero, and on the extinction of the Julian line, was not only unable to establish her freedom, but did not even venture a step in that direction. Results so opposite arising in one and the same city can only be accounted for by this, that in the time of the Tarquins the Roman people were not yet corrupted, but in these later times had become utterly corrupt. For on the first occasion, nothing more was needed to prepare and determine them to shake off their kings than that they should be bound by oath to suffer no king ever again to reign in Rome. Whereas afterwards, the authority and austere virtue of Brutus, backed by all the legions of the East, could not rouse them to maintain their hold of that freedom which he, following in the footsteps of the first Brutus, had won for them. And this because of the corruption with which the people had been infected by the Marian faction, whereof Caesar, becoming head, was able so to blind the multitude that it saw not the yoke under which it was about to lay its neck. Though this example of Rome be more complete than any other, I desire to instance, to the same effect, certain peoples well known in our own days, and I maintain that no change, however grave or violent, could ever restore freedom to Naples or Milan, because in these states the entire body of the people has grown corrupted. And so we find that Milan, although desirous to return to a free form of government on the death of Filippo Visconti, had neither the force nor the skill needed to preserve it. Most fortunate, therefore, was it for Rome that her kings grew corrupt soon, so as to be driven out before the taint of their corruption had reached the vitals of the city. For it was because these were sound that the endless commotions which took place in Rome, so far from being hurtful, were, from their object being good, beneficial to the commonwealth. From which we may draw this inference, that where the body of the people is still sound,
tumults and other like disorders do little hurt, but that where it has become corrupted, laws, however well devised, are of no advantage unless imposed by someone whose paramount authority causes them to be observed, until the community be once more restored to a sound and healthy condition. Whether this has ever happened, I know not, nor whether it ever can happen. For we see, as I have said a little way back, that a city which, owing to its pervading corruption, has once begun to decline, if it is to recover at all, must be saved not by the excellence of the people collectively, but by some one man then living among them, on whose death it at once relapses into its former plight, as happened with Thebes, in which the virtue of Epaminondas made it possible while he lived to preserve the form of a free government, but which fell again on his death into its old disorders. The reason being that hardly any ruler lives so long as to have time to accustom to right methods a city which has long been accustomed to wrong. Wherefore, unless things are put on a sound footing by some one ruler who lives to a very advanced age, or by two virtuous rulers succeeding one another, the city upon their death at once falls back into its ruins, or if it is preserved, must be so by incurring great risks and at the cost of much blood. For the corruption I speak of is wholly incompatible with a free government, because it results from an inequality that pervades the state, and can only be removed by employing unusual and very violent remedies, such as few are willing or know how to employ, as in another place I shall more fully explain.
Chapter 18. How a free government existing in a corrupt city may be preserved, or, not existing, may be introduced. I think it neither out of place nor inconsistent with what has been said above, to consider whether a free government existing in a corrupt city can be maintained, or, not existing, may be introduced. And on this head, I say that it is very difficult to bring about either of these results, and next to impossible to lay down rules as to how it may be done, because the measures to be taken must vary with the degree of corruption that prevails. Nevertheless, since it is well to reason things out, I will not pass this matter by, and will assume, in the first place, the case of a very corrupt city, and then take the case of one in which corruption has reached a still greater height. But where corruption is universal, no laws or institutions will ever have force to restrain it. Because, as good customs stand in need of good laws for their support, so laws, that they may be respected, stand in need of good customs. Moreover, the laws and institutions established in a republic at its beginning, when men were good, are no longer suitable when they have become bad. But while the laws of a city are altered to suit its circumstances, its institutions rarely or never change, whence it results that the introduction of new laws is of no avail, because the institutions, remaining unchanged, corrupt them. And to make this plainer, I say that in Rome it was first of all the institutions of the state, and next the laws as enforced by the magistrates, which kept the citizens under control. The institutions of the state consisted in the authority of the people, the Senate, the tribunes, and the consuls, in the methods of choosing and appointing magistrates, and in the arrangements for passing laws. These institutions changed little, if at all, with circumstances. But the laws by which the people were controlled, as for example the law relating to adultery, the sumptuary laws, the law as to canvassing at elections, and many others, were altered as the citizens grew more and more corrupted. Hence, the institutions of the state remaining the same, although, from the corruption of the people, no longer suitable, amendments in the laws could not keep men good, though they might have proved very useful if, at the time when they were made, the institutions had likewise been reformed. That its original institutions are no longer adapted to a city that has become corrupted is plainly seen in two matters of great moment, I mean, in the appointment of magistrates and in the passing of laws. For the Roman people conferred the consulship and other great offices of their state on none save those who sought them,
which was a good institution at first, because then none sought these offices save those who thought themselves worthy of them, and to be rejected was held disgraceful, so that to be deemed worthy all were on their best behavior. But in a corrupt city, this institution grew to be most mischievous, for it was no longer those of greatest worth, but those who had most influence, who sought the magistracies. And all who were without influence, however deserving, refrained through fear. This untoward result was not reached all at once, but like other similar results, by gradual steps. For after subduing Africa and Asia, and reducing nearly the whole of Greece to submission, the Romans became perfectly assured of their freedom, and seemed to themselves no longer to have any enemy whom they had cause to fear. But this security and the weakness of their adversaries led them in conferring the consulship no longer to look to merit, but only to favor, selecting for the office those who knew best how to pay court to them, not those who knew best to vanquish their enemies. And afterwards, instead of selecting those who were best liked, they came to select those who had most influence, and in this way, from the imperfection of their institutions, good men came to be wholly excluded. Again, as to making laws, any of the tribunes and certain others of the magistrates were entitled to submit laws to the people. But before these were passed, it was open to every citizen to speak either for or against those laws. This was a good system so long as the citizens were good, since it is always well that every man should be able to propose what he thinks may be of use to his country, and that all should be allowed to express their views with regard to his proposal, so that the people, having heard all, may resolve on what is best. But when the people grew depraved, this became a very mischievous institution. For then it was only the powerful who proposed laws, and these not in the interest of public freedom, but of their own authority. And because, through fear, none durst speak against the laws they proposed, the people were either deceived or forced into voting their own destruction. In order, therefore, that Rome, after she had become corrupted, might still preserve her freedom, it was necessary that, as in the course of events she had made new laws, so likewise she should frame new institutions, since different institutions and ordinances are needed in a corrupt state from those which suit a state which is not corrupted. For where the matter is wholly dissimilar, the form cannot be similar. But since old institutions must either be reformed all at once, as soon as they are seen to be no longer expedient, or else gradually, as the imperfection of each is recognized, I say that each of these two courses is all but impossible. For to effect a gradual reform requires a sagacious man who can discern mischief while it is still remote and in the germ. But it may well happen that no such person is found in a city, or that if found, he is unable to persuade others of what he himself is persuaded. For men used to live in one way are loath to leave it for another, especially when they are not brought face to face with the evil against which they should guard, and only have it indicated to them by conjecture. And as for a sudden reform of institutions which are seen by all to be no longer good, I say that defects which are easily discerned are not easily corrected, because for their correction it is not enough to use ordinary means, these being in themselves insufficient, but recourse must be had to extraordinary means, such as violence and arms, and as a preliminary you must become prince of the city, and be able to deal with it at your pleasure. But since the restoration of a state to new political life presupposes a good man, and to become prince of a city by violence presupposes a bad man, it can therefore very seldom happen that, although the end be good, a good man will be found ready to become a prince by evil ways, or that a bad man having become a prince will be disposed to act virtuously, or think of turning to good account his ill-acquired authority. From all these causes comes the difficulty, or rather the impossibility, which a corrupt city finds in maintaining an existing free government, or in establishing a new one. So that had we to establish or maintain a government in that city, it would be necessary to give it a monarchical form rather than a popular form, in order that men too arrogant to be restrained by the laws might in some measure be kept in check by a power almost absolute, since to attempt to make them good otherwise would be a very cruel or a wholly futile endeavor. This, as I have said, was the method followed by Cleomenes. And if he, that he might stand alone, put to death the Ephyres, and if Romulus, with a like object, put to death his brother and Titus Tatius the Sabine, and if both afterwards made good use of the authority they thus acquired, it is nevertheless to be remembered that it was because neither Cleomenes nor Romulus had to deal with such a corrupt people as that of which I am now speaking, that they were able to effect their ends and to give a fair color to their acts.
Chapter 19. After a strong prince, a weak prince may maintain himself, but after one weak prince, no kingdom can stand a second. When we contemplate the excellent qualities of Romulus, Numa, and Tullus, the first three kings of Rome, and note the methods which they followed, we recognize the extreme good fortune of that city in having her first king fierce and warlike, her second peaceful and religious, and her third, like the first, of a high spirit and more disposed to war than to peace. For it was essential for Rome that almost at the outset of her career a ruler should be found to lay the foundations of her civil life. But after that had been done, it was necessary that her rulers should return to the virtues of Romulus, since otherwise the city must have grown feeble and become a prey to her neighbors. And here we may note that a prince who succeeds to another of superior valor may reign on by virtue of his predecessor's merits, and reap the fruits of his labors. But if he live to a great age, or if he be followed by another who is wanting in the qualities of the first, that then the kingdom must necessarily dwindle. Conversely, when two consecutive princes are of rare excellence, we commonly find them achieving results which win for them enduring renown. David, for example, not only surpassed in learning and judgment, but was so valiant in arms that after conquering and subduing all his neighbors, he left to his young son Solomon a tranquil state, which the latter, though unskilled in the arts of war, could maintain by the arts of peace, and thus happily enjoy the inheritance of his father's valor. But Solomon could not transmit this inheritance to his son Rehoboam, who neither resembling his grandfather in valor, nor his father in good fortune, with difficulty made good his right to a sixth part of the kingdom. In like manner, Bayezid, Sultan of the Turks, though a man of peace rather than war, was able to enjoy the labors of Mahomet his father, who, like David, having subdued his neighbors, left his son a kingdom so safely established that it could easily be retained by him by peaceful arts. But had Selim, son to Bayezid, been like his father, and not like his grandson, the Turkish monarchy must have been overthrown. As it is, he seems likely to outdo the fame of his grandsire. I affirm it to be proved by these examples that after a valiant prince, a feeble prince may maintain himself, but that no kingdom can stand when two feeble princes follow in succession, unless, as in the case of France, it be supported by its ancient ordinances. By feeble princes, I mean such as are not valiant in war. And, to put the matter shortly, it may be said that the great valor of Romulus left Numa a period of many years within which to govern Rome by peaceful arts, that after Numa came Tullus, who renewed by his courage the fame of Romulus, and he in turn was succeeded by Ancus, a prince so gifted by nature that he could equally avail himself of the methods of peace or war, who set himself at first to pursue the former, when he found that his neighbors judged him to be effeminate and therefore held him in slight esteem, understood that to preserve Rome he must resort to arms and resemble Romulus rather than Numa. From whose example every ruler of a state may learn that a prince like Numa will hold or lose his power according to fortune and circumstances befriend him, but that the prince who resembles Romulus, and like him is fortified with foresight and arms, will hold his state whatever befall, unless deprived of it by some stubborn and irresistible force. For we can reckon with certainty that Rome, if she had not had for her third king one who knew how to restore her credit by deeds of valor, could not, or at any rate not without great difficulty, have afterwards held her ground, nor could she have ever achieved the great exploits she did.
And for these reasons, Rome, while she lived under her kings, was in constant danger of destruction through a king who might be weak or bad.
Chapter 20. That the consecutive reigns of two valiant princes produce great results, and that well-ordered commonwealths are assured of a succession of valiant rulers by whom their power and growth are rapidly extended. When Rome had driven out her kings, she was freed from those dangers to which, as I have said, she was exposed by the possible succession of a weak or wicked prince. For the chief share in the government then devolved upon the consuls, who took their authority not by inheritance, nor yet by craft or by ambitious violence, but by the free suffrages of their fellow citizens, and were always men of signal worth, by whose valor and good fortune Rome was constantly aided, was able to reach the height of her greatness in the same number of years as she had lived under her kings. And since we find that two successive reigns of valiant princes, as of Philip of Macedon and his son Alexander, suffice to conquer the world, it ought to be still easier for a commonwealth, which has it in its power to choose not two excellent rulers only, but an endless number in succession. And in every well-ordered commonwealth, provision will be made for a succession of this sort. Chapter 21. That it is a great reproach to a prince or to a commonwealth to be without a national army. Those princes and republics of the present day who lack forces of their own, whether for attack or defense, should take shame to themselves, and should be convinced by the example of Tullus that their deficiency does not arise from want of men fit for warlike enterprises, but from their own fault in not knowing how to make their subjects good soldiers. For after Rome had been at peace for 40 years, Tullus, succeeding to the kingdom, found not a single Roman who had ever been in battle. Nevertheless, when he made up his mind to enter on a war, it never occurred to him to have recourse to the Samnites, or the Etruscans, or to any of the other neighboring nations accustomed to arms. But he resolved, like the prudent prince he was, to rely on his own countrymen. And such was his ability that under his rule the people very soon became admirable soldiers. For nothing is more true than where a country, having men, lacks soldiers, it results from some fault in its ruler, and not from any defect in the situation or climate. Of this we have a very recent instance. Everyone knows how just the other day the King of England invaded the realm of France with an army raised wholly from among his own people, although from his country having been at peace for 30 years, he had neither men nor officers who had ever looked an enemy in the face. Nevertheless, he did not hesitate with such troops as he had to attack a kingdom well provided with officers and excellent soldiers who had been constantly under arms in the Italian wars. And this was possible through the prudence of the English king and the wise ordinances of his kingdom, which never, in time of peace, relaxes its warlike discipline. So too, in old times, Pelopidas and Epaminondas the Thebans, after they had freed Thebes from her tyrannies and rescued her from thraldom to Sparta, finding themselves in a city used to servitude and surrounded by an effeminate people, scrupled not, so great was their courage, to furnish these with arms and go forth with them to meet and to conquer the Spartan forces on the field. And he who relates this observes that these two captains very soon showed that warriors are not bred in Lacedaemon alone, but in every country where men are found, if only someone arise among them who knows how to direct them to arms, as we see Tullus knew how to direct the Romans. And nor could Virgil better express this opinion, or show by fitter words that he was convinced of its truth, than when he says, "To arms shall Tullus rouse his sluggish warriors." Chapter 22. What is to be noted in the combat of the 3 Roman Horatii and the 3 Alban Curiati. It was agreed between Tullus, king of Rome, and Metius, king of Alba, that the nation whose champions were victorious in combat should rule over the other. The 3 Alban Curiati were slain. One of the Roman Horatii survived, whereupon the Alban king with all his people became subject to the Romans. The surviving Horatius, returning victorious to Rome, and meeting his sister, wife to one of the dead Curiati, bewailing the death of her husband, slew her, and being tried for this crime, was, after much contention, liberated, rather on the entreaties of his father than for his own deserts.
Herein 3 points are to be noted. First, that we should never peril our whole fortunes on the success of only a part of our forces. Second, that in a well-governed state, merit should never be allowed to balance crime. And third, that those are never wise covenants which we cannot or should not expect to be observed. Now, for a state to be enslaved is so terrible a calamity that it ought never have been supposed possible that either of these kings or nations would rest content under a slavery resulting from the defeat of only 3 of their number. And so it appeared to Metius. For although on the victory of the Roman champions he had once confessed himself vanquished and promised obedience, nevertheless, in the very first expedition which he and Tullus undertook jointly against the people of Veii, he found seeking to circumvent the Roman, as though perceiving too late the rash part he had played. This is enough to say of the third point which I noted as deserving attention. Of the other 2, I shall speak in the next 2 chapters.
Chapter 23. That we should never hazard our whole fortunes where we put not our entire strength, for which reason to guard a defile is often hurtful. It was never judged a prudent course to peril your whole fortunes where you put not your entire strength, as may happen in more ways than one. One of these ways was that taken by Tullus and Metius, when each staked the existence of his country and the credit of his army on the valor and good fortune of only 3 of his soldiers, that being an utterly insignificant fraction of the force at his disposal. For neither of these kings reflected that all the labors of their predecessors in framing such institutions for their states, which might, with the aid of the citizens themselves, maintain them long in freedom, were rendered futile when the power to ruin all was left in the hands of so small a number. No rasher step, therefore, could have been taken than was taken by these kings. A like risk is almost always incurred by those who, on the approach of an enemy, resolve to defend some place of strength, or to guard the defiles by which their country is entered. For unless room be found in this place of strength for almost all your army, the attempt to hold it will almost always prove hurtful. If you can find room, it will be right to defend your strong places. But if these be difficult of access, and you cannot keep your entire force there together, the effort to defend is mischievous. I come to this conclusion from observing the example of those who, although their territories be enclosed by mountains and precipices, have not, on being attacked by powerful enemies, attempted to fight on the mountains or in the defiles, but have advanced beyond them to meet their foes, or, if unwilling to advance, have awaited attack behind their mountains on level and not on broken ground. The reason of which is, as I have above explained, that many men cannot be assembled in these strong places for their defense, partly because a large number of men cannot long subsist there, and partly because such places being narrow and confined afford for room of only a few, so that no enemy can there be withstood who comes in force to the attack, which he can do easily, his design being to pass on and not to make a stay. Whereas he who stands on the defensive cannot do so in force, because, from not knowing when the enemy may enter the confined and sterile tracts of which I speak, he may have to lodge himself there for a long time. But if you lose some pass which you had reckoned on holding, and on the defense of which your country and army have relied, there commonly follows such panic among your people and among the troops which remain to you, that you are vanquished without opportunity given for any display of valor, and lose everything without bringing all your resources into play. Everyone has heard with how difficulty Hannibal crossed the Alps that divide France from Lombardy, and afterwards those that separate Lombardy from Tuscany. Nevertheless, the Romans awaited him in the first instance on the banks of the Ticino, in the second on the plain of Arezzo, preferring to be defeated on ground which at least gave them a chance of victory than leading their army into mountain fastnesses where it was likely to be destroyed by the mere difficulties of the ground. And any who read history with attention will find that very few capable commanders have attempted to hold castles of this nature, as well for the reasons already given, as for closing them all were impossible.
For mountains, like plains, are traversed not only by well-known and frequented roads, but also by many byways, which, though unknown to strangers, are familiar to the people of the country, under whose guidance you may always, and in spite of any opposition, be easily conducted to whatever point you please. Of this we have a recent instance in the events of the year 1515. For when Francis I of France resolved to invade Italy in order to recover the province of Lombardy, those hostile to his attempt looked mainly to the Swiss, who it was hoped would stop him in passing through their mountains. But this hope was disappointed by the event. For leaving on one side 2 or 3 defiles which were guarded by the Swiss, the king advanced by another unknown pass, and was in Italy and upon his enemies before they knew. Whereupon they fled terror-stricken into Milan, and the whole population of Lombardy, finding themselves deceived in their expectation that the French would be detained in the mountains, went over to their side.
Chapter 24. That well-ordered states always provide rewards and punishments for their citizens, and never set off deserts against misdeeds. The valor of Horatius in vanquishing the Curiati deserved the highest reward. But in slaying his sister, he had been guilty of a heinous crime. And so displeasing to the Romans was an outrage of this nature, that although his services were so great and so recent, they brought him to trial for his life. To one looking at it carelessly, this might seem an instance of popular ingratitude. But he who considers the matter more closely, and examines with sounder judgment what ordinances of a state should be, will rather blame the Romans for acquitting Horatius than for putting him on trial. And this because no well-ordered state ever strikes a balance between the services of its citizens and their misdeeds, but appointing rewards for good actions and punishment for bad. When it has rewarded a man for acting well, it will afterwards, should he act ill, chastise him without regard to his former deserts. When these ordinances are duly observed, a city will live long in freedom, but when they are neglected, it must soon come to ruin. For when a citizen has rendered a splendid service to his country, if to the distinction which his action in itself confers were added an overweening confidence that any crime he might thenceforth commit would pass unpunished, he would soon become so arrogant that no civil bonds could restrain him. Still, while we would have punishment terrible to wrongdoers, it is essential that good actions should be rewarded, as we see to have been the case in Rome. For even where a republic is poor and has but little to give, it ought not to withhold that little, since a gift, however small, bestowed as a reward for services however great, will always be esteemed most honorable and precious by him who receives it. The story of Horatius Cocles and that of Mucius Scaeva are well known, how the one withstood the enemy on the bridge while it was being cut down, and the other thrust his hand into the fire in punishment of the mistake made when he sought the life of Porsena, the Etruscan king. To each of these two, in requital of their splendid deeds, 2 plough-gates only of the public land were given. Another famous story is that of Manlius Capitolinus, to whom, for having saved the capital from the besieging Gauls, a small measure of meal was given by each of those who were shut up with him during the siege, which recompense, in proportion to the wealth of the citizens of Rome at that time, was thought ample, so that afterwards, when Manlius, moved by jealousy and malice, sought to arouse sedition in Rome and to gain over the people to his cause, they, without regard to his past services, threw him headlong from that capital in saving which he had formerly gained so great a renown. Chapter 25. That who would reform the institutions of a free state must retain at least the semblance of old ways.
Whoever takes upon him to reform the government of a city must, if his measures are to be well received and carried out with general approval, preserve at least the semblance of existing methods, so as to not appear to the people to have made any change in the old order of things, although, in truth, the new ordinances differ altogether from those which they replace. For when this is attended to, the mass of mankind accept what seems as what is, nay, are often touched more nearly by appearances than by realities. This tendency being recognized by the Romans at the very outset of their civil freedom, when they appointed 2 consuls in place of a single king, they would not permit the consuls to have more than 12 lictors, in order that the old number of the king's attendants might not be exceeded. Again, there being solemnized every year in Rome a sacrificial rite which could be performed only by the king in person, that the people might not be led by the absence of the king to remark the want of any ancient observance, a priest was appointed for the due celebration of this rite, to whom was given the name of Rex Sacrificalis, and who was placed under the orders of the chief priest. In this way, the people were contented, and had no occasion from any defect in the solemnities to desire the return of their kings. Like precautions should be used by all who would put an end to the old government of a city, and substitute new and free institutions. For since novelty disturbs men's minds, we should seek in the changes we make to preserve as far as possible what is ancient, so that, if the new magistrates differ from the old in number, in authority, or in the duration of their office, they shall at least retain the old names. This, I say, should be seen by him who would establish a constitutional government, whether in the form of a commonwealth or of a kingdom. But he who would create an absolute government, of the kind which political writers term a tyranny, must renew everything, as shall be explained in the following chapter. Chapter 26. A new prince in a city or province of which he has taken possession ought to make everything new. Whosoever becomes prince of a city or state, more especially if his position be so insecure that he cannot resort to constitutional government, either in the form of a republic or a monarchy, will find that the best way to preserve his princedom is to renew the whole institutions of that state, that is to say, to create new magistracies with new names, confer new powers, and employ new men, and like David, when he became king, exalt the humble and depress the great, filling the hungry with good things, and sending the rich empty away. Moreover, he must pull down existing towns and rebuild them, removing their inhabitants from one place to another, and in short leave nothing in the country as he found it, so that there shall be neither rank, nor condition, nor honor, nor wealth, which its possessor can refer to any but to him. And he must take example of Philip of Macedonia, the father of Alexander, who by means such as these, from being a petty prince, became monarch of all Greece, and of whom it was written that he shifted men from province to province, as a shepherd moves his flocks from one pasture to another. These indeed are most cruel expedients, contrary not merely to every Christian, but to every civilized rule of conduct, and such as every man should shun, choosing rather to lead a private life than to be a king on terms so hurtful to mankind. But he who will not keep to the fair path of virtue must, to maintain himself, enter this path of evil. Men, however, not knowing how to be wholly good or wholly bad, choose for themselves certain middle ways, which are of all others the most pernicious, as shall be shown by an instance in the following chapter. Chapter 27. That men seldom know how to be wholly good or wholly bad. When in the year 1505, Pope Julius II went to Bologna to expel from that city the family of the Bentivogli, who had been princes there for over 100 years. It was also in his mind, as a part of the general design he had planned against all those lords who had usurped church lands, to remove Giovan Pagolo Bagiolini, tyrant of Perugia. And coming to Perugia with this intention and resolve, of which all men knew, he would not wait to enter the town with a force sufficient for his protection, but entered it unattended by troops, although Giovan Pagolo was there with a great company of soldiers whom he had assembled for his defense. And thus, urged on by that impetuosity which stamped all his actions, accompanied only by his bodyguard, he committed himself into the hands of his enemy, whom he forthwith carried away with him, leaving a governor behind to hold the town for the church. All prudent men who were with the Pope remarked on his temerity and on the pusillanimity of Giovan Pagolo, nor could they conjecture why he had not, to his eternal glory, availed himself of this opportunity for crushing his enemy, and at the same time enriching himself with plunder, the Pope being attended by the whole college of cardinals, with all their luxurious equipage. For it could not be supposed that he was withheld by any promptings of goodness or scruples of conscience, because in the breast of a profligate living in incest with his sister, and who to obtain the princedom had put his nephews and kinsmen to death, no virtuous impulse could prevail, so that the only inference to be drawn was that men know not how to be splendidly wicked or wholly good, and shrink in consequence from such crimes as are stamped with an inherent greatness or disclose a nobility of nature. For which reason Giovan Pagolo, who thought nothing of incurring the guilt of incest or of murdering his kinsman, could not, or more truly durst not, avail himself of a fair occasion to do a deed which all would have admired, which would have won him a deathless fame, as the first to teach the prelates how little those who live and reign as they do are to be esteemed, and which would have displayed a greatness far transcending any infamy or danger that could attach to it. Chapter 28. Whence it came that the Romans were less ingrateful to their citizens than were the Athenians. In the histories of all republics, we meet with instances of some sort of ingratitude to their great citizens, but fewer in the history of Rome than of Athens, or indeed of any other republic. Searching for the cause of this, I'm persuaded that so far as regards Rome and Athens, it was due to the Romans having had less occasion than the Athenians to look upon their fellow citizens with suspicion. For from the expulsion of his kings down to the times of Sylla and Marius, the liberty of Rome was never subverted by any one of her citizens, so that there never was in that city grave cause for distrusting any man, and in consequence making him the victim of inconsiderate injustice. The reverse was notoriously the case with Athens, for that city, having at a time when she was most flourishing, been deprived of her freedom by Pisistratus under a false show of goodwill, remembering, after she regained her liberty, her former bondage, and all the wrongs she had endured, became the relentless chastiser not only of offenses, but even of the shadow of an offense. Hence the banishment and death of so many excellent men, and hence the law of ostracism, and all those other violent measures which from time to time during the history of that city were directed against her foremost citizens. For this is most true, which is asserted by the writers on civil government, that a people which has recovered its freedom bites more fiercely than one which has always preserved it. And any who shall weigh well what has been said here will not condemn Athens in this matter, nor commend Rome, but refer all to the necessity arising out of the different conditions prevailing in the two states. For careful reflection will show that had Rome been deprived of her freedom as Athens was, she would not have been a whit more tender to her citizens. This we may reasonably infer from remarking what, after the expulsion of the kings, befell Collatinus and Publius Valerius. the former of whom, though he had taken part in the liberation of Rome, was sent into exile for no other reason than he bore the name of Tarquin, while the sole ground of suspicion against the latter, and what almost led to his banishment, was his having built a house on the Caelian hill. Seeing how harsh and suspicious Rome was in these two instances, we may surmise that she would have shown the same ingratitude as Athens, had she, like Athens, been wronged by her citizens at an early stage of her growth, and before she had attained to the fullness of her strength. That I may not have to return to this question of ingratitude, I shall say all that remains to be said about it in my next chapter.
Thank you for listening to Part 1 of Discourses on Livy by Niccolò Machiavelli, presented by Noctis Inkborne. We hope this narration has offered clarity, insight, and a peaceful reading experience as you explored the beginning of this timeless work. The second part of this audiobook is currently in preparation and will be uploaded very soon. Stay connected and continue this journey with us as we complete the full narration of Discourses on Livy. Until then, thank you for supporting Noctis Inkborne.